My friend joked about my miscarriage being practice. Her husband didn't know about her abortion. I've been raising Haley since she was 12, paid for her college, $40,000, bought her car, covered her living expenses for 6 years. Her biological father? Paid nothing. Not 1 cent of child support. Shows up maybe twice a year, usually drunk, always making promises he breaks, but she worships him. When Haley got engaged, my girlfriend Maria and I offered to pay for the wedding. $35,000 budget. Venue for 250 people. The works. You're the best dad ever. Haley hugged me, crying, I'm so lucky to have you. I gave them a list of 20 people to invite. My brother, my business partners, my college roommates. Of course, Maria promised. You're paying for everything. That's the least we can do. Saturday, I ran into my business partner Jim at the golf club. Beautiful announcement, he said, though I was surprised not to get an invitation. What do you mean? You're on the list. He pulled the announcement from his car. Cream cardstock, gold embossing. Together with their families, Haley Russell and Blake Stevens invite you to celebrate their marriage. At the bottom, daughter of Maria Russell and Robert Russell. Robert, her biological father. My name was nowhere on it. Must be a mistake, Jim said, seeing my face. It wasn't. None of your 20 people made the final list, Maria admitted when I confronted her. We had to make cuts. Family comes first. I'm not family? You know what I mean. Blood family. Robert's entire side is invited? The man who hasn't seen her in 18 months? He's her father. I paid for everything. If people decline, maybe we can squeeze someone in. I was going to cancel everything. Then Haley called, crying, Please don't fight with Mom about the guest list. This wedding means everything to me. You mean everything to me. I need you there. So I swallowed my pride. Sunday dinner with the in-laws. Maria made her famous lasagna. Blake's parents brought wine. We were discussing centerpieces when the doorbell rang. Robert walked in. Leather jacket, 3-day stubble, reeking of cigarettes. Daddy! Haley flew into his arms. Hey, princess. Sorry I'm late. My bike broke down. The man is 47. Still rides a motorcycle he can't maintain. Still calls it his bike, like he's 17. We sat down to dinner. Robert took my seat at the head of the table. Nobody said anything. Then Haley stood up, tapping her wine glass. I have an announcement. Everyone smiled, expecting pregnancy news. Daddy called me yesterday with amazing news. He'll be able to make the wedding, which means... She beamed at Robert. He can walk me down the aisle. The table erupted in congratulations. Maria squeezed Robert's shoulder. Oh, honey, that's wonderful. It wouldn't be the same without you giving our baby away. Blake's mother was crying. A girl needs her father on her wedding day. I sat there, invisible. 10 years of driving her to school, teaching her to drive, staying up when she was sick, moving her into college, helping with homework, paying for everything, erased. I stood up. The chair scraped against the floor. I'd like to make a toast. Everyone raised their glasses, smiling. It has been my great pleasure to be part of this family for the past decade. Haley beamed at me. At this point, I feel I owe a debt of gratitude to the bride and groom because they have opened my eyes to something very important. Maria's smile flickered. They've shown me that my position in this family is not what I once thought it was. Though I considered myself a father figure, someone worthy of respect and inclusion, it seems instead I hold the position of an ATM. Good for a stream of money, but not much else. Haley's face went white. As I've been replaced as father of the bride, both on the invitations and in the ceremony, I am resigning my financial duties as well. Robert, as the real father, I'm sure you'll be happy to cover the remaining wedding costs. $28,000, due Thursday. Robert choked on his wine. What? Haley gasped. The venue needs final payment by Thursday or you lose the date. I'm sure your real dad has it covered. This is ridiculous, Maria stood. You can't just... You all can see yourselves out of my house. Your house? Maria laughed bitterly. My name is on the deed too. Check again. I bought this house before we met. Your name is on nothing. The room exploded. Shouting, crying, Blake's parents trying to mediate. I walked to my office and locked the door. Monday morning, I called the venue and vendors, canceling everything. Lost my deposits, but worth every penny. Then I got a call from my lawyer. Mike, we have a problem. Maria filed an emergency petition. She's claiming common law marriage and wants half of everything. We never married. She has documents. Did you ever file taxes jointly? Sign anything saying she was your spouse? My blood went cold. 3 years ago, Maria needed surgery. I'd signed insurance forms listing her as my domestic partner to get her covered under my plan. She also has something else. A will you supposedly signed leaving everything to Haley. I never signed. Mike, I'm looking at it. It's notarized. Dated last month. Last month when I was traveling for business. When Maria had asked me to sign some insurance updates over video call. I'd been distracted, trusted her, signed without reading. There's more, my lawyer said. Haley isn't her biological daughter. What? Maria isn't Haley's birth mother, which means the girl you've been raising, paying for, calling your stepdaughter? You might have more claim to her than either of them. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number with a photo. It was a DNA test. Haley and Robert. Probability of paternity, 0%. Another text. We need to talk. Alone. Robert. I texted Robert back and told him to meet me at Mel's Diner on Route 9. The place sits 30 minutes outside town where nobody we know ever goes. I got there first and grabbed a booth in the back corner. My hands shook as I ordered coffee I didn't want. Robert walked in 10 minutes later looking worse than I'd ever seen him. His leather jacket hung loose on his frame like he'd lost weight. The stubble on his face had grown into a patchy beard. He slid into the booth across from me without saying anything. I pulled out my phone and showed him the DNA test he'd sent. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila folder, sliding it across the table. Inside was his own copy of the results, official lab letterhead and everything. We sat there staring at the papers between us. The waitress came by and Robert ordered whiskey even though it was barely noon. She brought it and he downed half the glass before speaking. He told me Maria had called him 3 months back asking him to update his will. She wanted him to list Haley as his main person to get everything when he died. He didn't have much, but the request felt weird. Maria had never cared about his will before. She'd spent years telling him to stay away and not mess up Haley's life. Suddenly she was worried about making sure Haley got his stuff. Robert said something in her voice sounded wrong. Desperate, maybe. He'd been sober for 2 months at that point, and his head was clear enough to notice things. He went to a clinic and paid for a DNA test without telling anyone. The results came back 2 weeks ago and destroyed him. He'd spent 22 years believing Haley was his daughter. Every time Maria called him a deadbeat father, every time Haley looked at him with those disappointed eyes, he'd carried that guilt. Now he finds out none of it was real. Maria had been lying to both of us this whole time. I asked him why he played along with the absent father act. Robert finished his whiskey and ordered another. He admitted Maria had been paying him $500 a month to stay away except for a few visits per year. She told him Haley needed stability, and his drinking would ruin that. She'd give him money to keep his distance, but show up just enough that Haley remembered him. He took the deal because he needed the cash and figured Maria was right about him being a mess. But now he understood she was buying his absence to keep control. She wanted Haley to worship a father who was never there so she'd cling to Maria and never question anything. And she wanted me around as the wallet who paid for everything while getting no credit. We compared stories and the pattern became clear. Maria had been working both of us like puppets. She kept Robert at a distance with cash payments and guilt trips. She kept me close with promises of family and love while making sure I never got real recognition. Haley was the tool she used to control us both. Every time I paid for something, Maria made sure Haley thanked her instead of me. Every time Robert tried to be more involved, Maria reminded him he was a drunk who'd ruin everything. I pulled out the forged will Owen had told me about. Robert's face went white when he saw it. He said Maria had asked him to witness some insurance papers for her last month over video call. She'd held them up to the camera and he'd confirmed her signature looked right. He never saw what the actual document said. We'd both been tricked into helping her commit fraud. I paid for Robert's drinks and we left the diner together. He followed me in his truck to Owen's office downtown. Owen's assistant showed us into a conference room and Owen came in looking surprised to see Robert with me. I laid out both DNA tests on the table. Owen picked them up and studied them carefully. His face changed as he read through the results. He looked up at me and said, "This changed everything." Maria's whole legal case was built on being Haley's mother and having family rights. If she wasn't the biological mother and Robert wasn't the biological father, then what legal relationship did Maria actually have to Haley? Owen started making notes on his legal pad. He said we needed to find out if Maria legally adopted Haley or if she just took the baby and pretended to be the birth mother. If there were no legal adoption papers, Maria might have been raising a child she had no legal right to. That would destroy her common law marriage claim and her argument that she deserved half my assets. Owen said he'd file an emergency motion first thing tomorrow morning. He'd ask the judge to freeze all legal proceedings until we could investigate Haley's real parentage and Maria's legal relationship to her. We needed to force Maria to produce adoption records and birth certificates. Owen thought the judge would grant the motion once he saw the DNA evidence. Robert sat quiet through the whole meeting, but nodded when Owen asked if he'd testify about Maria's payments and manipulation. The next morning, Owen filed the emergency motion with the court. He attached both DNA tests and a statement from Robert about the monthly payments. The judge scheduled a hearing for that afternoon. Maria's lawyer showed up looking confused and angry. Owen presented the DNA evidence and explained that neither Maria nor Robert appeared to be Haley's biological parents. The judge's face got serious as he read through the documents. He asked Maria's lawyer if they had any adoption records or birth certificates to present. The lawyer stammered and said they'd need time to gather documents. The judge granted Owen's motion and ordered all proceedings frozen. He gave Maria's lawyer 1 week to produce legal documentation proving Maria's relationship to Haley. If they couldn't provide proper adoption records, the judge said he'd have to question the entire basis of Maria's claims. Maria's lawyer tried to argue, but the judge cut him off. He said this was a serious matter involving potential fraud and false identity documents. The court needed to establish the basic facts before proceeding with any property claims. Owen walked out of the courthouse looking satisfied. He told me this was the break we needed. Maria had built her whole case on being Haley's mother and my domestic partner. If we could prove she'd been lying about Haley's parentage from the start, everything else she'd done would look like part of a bigger fraud. Over the next 3 days, Maria's lawyer kept requesting extensions. They finally produced a set of adoption papers on the 4th day. Owen got copies and brought them to his office. We sat down and went through every page. The papers listed Maria Russell as birth mother and Robert Russell as birth father. But Owen pointed out problems right away. The dates didn't match up with when Haley would have been born based on her current age. The hospital listed on the birth certificate didn't exist anymore, and Owen couldn't find records of it ever operating in our state. The notary signature looked fake, and when Owen tracked down the notary, she said she'd never notarized any adoption papers for Maria. Owen filed a motion to subpoena hospital records from every facility in the state around the time Haley was born. Maria's lawyer objected, but the judge ordered the records produced. 2 weeks later, the results came back. No hospital in our state had any record of Maria Russell giving birth 22 years ago. No birth certificate existed for a baby girl born to Maria Russell on Haley's birthday. Owen spread the hospital records across his desk and looked at me. He said Maria had committed massive fraud. She'd created fake adoption papers and a fake birth certificate. She'd been lying about being Haley's mother for over 2 decades. I asked Owen what we should do next. He said we needed to find out who Haley's real parents were and how Maria ended up with her. That meant hiring someone who specialized in this kind of investigation. He recommended a private investigator named Felix Hansen, who worked adoption fraud and family cases. I called Felix that afternoon and he agreed to meet me the next day. Felix showed up at Owen's office wearing jeans and a button-down shirt. He looked more like a teacher than a detective. He listened to the whole story without interrupting. When I finished, he asked for copies of everything we had: the DNA tests, the fake adoption papers, the hospital records. He said he'd start by tracking Maria's background before she moved to our state. He wanted to know where she came from and what her life looked like before Haley appeared. I wrote Felix a check for his retainer and he left with a box full of documents. Owen said it might take weeks to get answers, but we needed to be patient. That same night, my phone rang. Haley's name showed up on the screen. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her words. She begged me to talk to her and explain what was happening. Blake had told her about the court hearings and the DNA tests. She didn't understand why I was attacking her mother or what any of this meant. I told her I'd meet her tomorrow at the coffee shop on Main Street. But I said Owen had to be there too because this was a legal matter now. She agreed and hung up still crying. The coffee shop on Main Street was nearly empty when Haley walked in the next morning. She looked terrible, eyes red and puffy, hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Owen sat next to me at a corner table, his briefcase open with documents spread between us. Haley slid into the chair across from me and stared at her hands. I pushed the DNA test results across the table. The paper showed Robert's name and Haley's name with that single devastating line underneath. Probability of paternity, 0%. She picked it up with shaking fingers and read it 3 times. Her lips moved silently as she processed the words. She set it down carefully like it might explode. She told me this had to be wrong, that labs made mistakes all the time, that someone must have switched the samples. Owen explained the test used a certified lab with chain of custody documentation. There was no mistake. Haley's face crumbled. She asked what this meant, who her father was if not Robert. I told her we didn't know yet, but we were finding out. She started crying, not the gentle tears from our last conversation, but deep sobs that shook her whole body. The barista glanced over nervously. Owen handed her tissues from his briefcase. She asked if Maria knew about this. I said Maria had to know because she'd been lying about everything for 22 years. Haley wiped her eyes and said her whole life was fake, that she didn't know who she was anymore. I reached across the table, but she pulled her hands back. She asked why I was doing this, why I couldn't just let things be. I told her Maria had committed fraud and possibly worse, and we needed the truth. She stood up suddenly, knocking her chair backwards. She said she couldn't do this right now and ran out of the coffee shop. Owen and I sat there watching her car peel out of the parking lot. 2 days later, my phone rang while I was reviewing contracts at my office. Felix's name showed on the screen. He said he'd found something about Maria's background that I needed to hear. I told him to come by whenever he could. He showed up an hour later with a thick folder under his arm. He spread papers across my desk, old newspaper clippings and printed documents. He said Maria wasn't always Maria Russell. 22 years ago, she lived in Arizona under her married name Maria Stiles. She'd been married to a man named Paul Stiles for 3 years. Felix pointed to a wedding announcement from a local Arizona paper. The woman in the grainy photo was definitely Maria, younger, but unmistakably her. He said the marriage ended badly around the time Maria left Arizona with baby Haley. Felix pulled out another document, a police report from Arizona dated 22 years ago. Paul Stiles had reported his sister missing. The sister's name was Celia Williams. She'd disappeared without a trace just weeks before Maria left the state. The case had gone cold after a few months with no leads. I stared at the police report, trying to make sense of the timeline. Felix said the dates lined up too perfectly to be coincidence. Maria left Arizona with a baby the same month her sister-in-law vanished. He'd requested the full case file from Arizona authorities, but it would take time to get everything. I called Owen immediately and asked him to come to my office. He arrived within 30 minutes and Felix walked him through everything again. Owen studied the police report and the newspaper clippings. He asked Felix if there was any evidence linking Maria directly to the disappearance. Felix said not yet, but he was working on it. Owen leaned back in his chair and said if Maria took her sister-in-law's baby and fled the state, we were looking at kidnapping charges. This wasn't just fraud anymore. This was potentially a federal crime. I felt sick thinking about what this meant. Felix said he needed to dig deeper into what happened in Arizona. He wanted to find Paul Stiles and get his side of the story. Owen agreed and said we should move carefully because if this turned into a criminal investigation, everything would change. He told Felix to document everything and maintain chain of custody on any evidence. Felix packed up his folder and said he'd call as soon as he learned more. After he left, Owen and I sat in my office not saying much. The implications were too big to process. If Maria had stolen Haley from her biological mother, then everything about the past 22 years was built on a crime. Felix called me 4 days later, sounding excited. He said he'd tracked down Paul Stiles in Arizona and arranged a phone call. Paul still lived in the same small town where he'd grown up. Felix had explained the situation carefully without revealing too much. Paul had agreed to talk to me directly. Felix gave me Paul's number and told me to call that evening. I sat in my home office at 8 o'clock with the phone in my hand. My heart pounded as I dialed. A man answered on the second ring with a cautious hello. I introduced myself and explained I'd been raising a young woman named Haley for the past 10 years. There was complete silence on the other end. Then Paul made a choking sound like he couldn't breathe. He asked me to repeat the name. I said Haley Russell, 22 years old, raised by Maria Russell. Paul started crying. He said he'd been searching for his sister's daughter for 22 years. He'd hired private investigators, posted on missing persons forums, never given up hope. He asked if Haley was okay, if she was safe and healthy. I told him she was fine, getting married soon, finishing college. Paul sobbed with relief. He said Maria had destroyed his family and stolen the only piece of his sister he had left. I asked him to tell me everything that happened. Paul's voice shook as he explained. His sister Celia had gotten pregnant by her boyfriend, who took off when he found out about the baby. Celia was 20 years old, scared, but determined to be a good mother. Maria had been married to Paul at the time and offered to help Celia with the baby. Maria couldn't have kids of her own, and Paul thought she just wanted to be supportive. Celia gave birth to a healthy baby girl. Maria was at the hospital and took dozens of pictures. For the first few weeks, Maria came over constantly to help with feedings and diaper changes. Celia was grateful for the support. Then one morning, Paul went to check on Celia and found the apartment empty. The baby was gone. All of Celia's things were still there, but she and the infant had vanished. Paul called the police immediately. They searched for 3 weeks with no leads. Then a hiker found Celia's body in the desert 15 miles outside town. The medical examiner ruled it an apparent drug overdose. Paul told the police his sister didn't use drugs, that she'd been clean her whole pregnancy and excited about motherhood. Nobody listened. They closed the case as an accidental death. The baby was never found. Paul said he confronted Maria after Celia's funeral. She acted shocked and claimed she had no idea what happened. But Paul noticed Maria had packed up and left town within a week. He tried to track her, but she'd disappeared completely. He filed missing persons reports for the baby, but without proof Maria had taken her, the police couldn't do anything. Paul spent years searching, convinced Maria had stolen his niece and somehow caused his sister's death. He could never prove it. Now, 22 years later, I was calling to tell him he'd been right all along. Paul asked if he could meet Haley. I told him we needed to verify everything first, but yes, eventually. He thanked me over and over, saying he'd almost given up hope. After we hung up, I sat in the dark office trying to process everything. Maria hadn't just committed fraud. She'd likely murdered her sister-in-law and stolen her baby. Felix booked a flight to Arizona the next morning. He said he needed to meet Paul face-to-face and collect any evidence Paul had saved. Owen agreed this was the right move and told Felix to get everything documented properly. Felix landed in Phoenix and drove 2 hours to the small town where Paul lived. He called me from Paul's house that evening. Paul had kept everything from the investigation in boxes in his garage. Photos of baby Haley with Celia at the hospital. Medical records showing Celia as the mother. The police reports from the missing persons case. Newspaper articles about Celia's death. Felix said Paul had maintained a shrine to his sister and the lost baby for over 2 decades. He'd never stopped believing they'd been murdered. Felix was photographing and cataloging everything. He said the evidence was overwhelming. Paul had original documents that would prove Maria's entire story was fabricated. The birth certificate Felix found listed Celia Williams as mother with the father marked as unknown. The baby's name was listed as Baby Girl Williams, born at Mesa General Hospital. Paul had the hospital bracelet Celia wore during delivery. He had photos of Maria holding the newborn in the hospital room. Felix said this was enough to prove Maria had access to the baby and knew exactly who the biological mother was. Paul also had something else valuable. He'd kept some of Celia's belongings, including her hairbrush with strands of hair still caught in the bristles. Felix asked if we could use that for DNA testing. Owen said absolutely, that we needed definitive proof Haley was Celia's biological daughter. Felix carefully bagged the hairbrush and prepared to fly back with all the evidence. He told Paul we'd be in touch soon with next steps. Paul made Felix promise to let him know the moment the DNA results came back. Felix returned 3 days later with 2 large boxes of evidence. Owen and I met him at his office to go through everything. The photos were the hardest to look at. Celia holding her newborn daughter with pure joy on her face. Maria standing next to the hospital bed with an expression that now looked predatory. Baby Haley wrapped in a pink blanket, completely unaware her life was about to be stolen. Owen arranged for the DNA testing through the same lab that had done the paternity test with Robert. They said results would take about 2 weeks. Felix organized all of Paul's evidence into a timeline showing exactly what happened 22 years ago. The picture was clear. Maria had befriended a vulnerable new mother, gained her trust, then taken everything from her. We still couldn't prove Maria killed Celia, but the circumstantial evidence was strong. Owen said once we had DNA confirmation, we'd need to contact Arizona authorities about reopening the investigation into Celia's death. While we waited for the DNA results, Maria's lawyer called Owen. The lawyer's voice was aggressive, demanding we cease our investigation immediately. He said we were harassing his client with baseless accusations, and if we didn't stop, Maria would file defamation charges. Owen listened calmly, then asked if the lawyer was aware his client was under investigation for kidnapping and possible homicide. The line went quiet. Owen explained we'd contacted authorities in Arizona regarding the disappearance of Celia Williams and her infant daughter 22 years ago. We had substantial evidence suggesting Maria had taken the child and fled the state. The lawyer stammered something about needing to consult with his client. Owen said that was a good idea. He also mentioned we had DNA evidence pending that would conclusively prove Maria wasn't Haley's biological mother. The lawyer hung up without another word. Owen smiled grimly and said Maria was running out of options. Her entire house of lies was collapsing. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept checking my phone every few minutes, expecting something to happen. Around 11, I got up and made coffee. My hands were shaking when I poured it. The house was too quiet. Every creak made me jump. I walked through the rooms, looking at everything Maria had touched over the years. Her magazines on the coffee table, her sweater draped over the chair, her coffee mug in the sink. All these little pieces of a life she'd built on lies. The doorbell rang at midnight. I looked through the peephole and saw Maria standing on my porch. Her hair was a mess. Her mascara was smeared down her face. She was wearing sweatpants and a torn jacket. I'd never seen her look like that before. She rang the bell again, then started pounding on the door. I opened it and she practically fell into the house. She grabbed my arms and started begging. Her voice was high and desperate. She said I had to stop the investigation. She said I was destroying everything. She said Haley would never forgive me. I stepped back and she followed me into the living room. She was talking so fast I could barely understand her. Something about how she'd saved Haley from a terrible situation. How she'd given her a good life. How that justified everything she'd done. I pulled out my phone and opened the voice recorder app. My thumb was shaking, but I managed to hit record. I slipped the phone into my shirt pocket with the microphone facing out. Maria kept talking. She said Celia was unfit to be a mother. She said Celia was using drugs and leaving the baby alone. She said someone had to step in. I asked her directly if she took Haley from Arizona. She nodded and said she deserved to be a mother. She said she'd tried for years to have a baby with Paul but couldn't. She said when she saw Celia with that perfect little girl, she knew it was meant to be hers. I asked what happened to Celia. Maria's face went white. She said Celia made her own choices. She said Celia was weak. She said some people aren't meant to survive in this world. She didn't say the words directly, but the way she talked made it clear. The desperation in her voice told me everything I needed to know. I told her to leave. She started crying harder and reached for me. I stepped away and pointed at the door. She stumbled out into the night and I locked the door behind her. My whole body was shaking. I listened to the recording 3 times to make sure it was clear. Every word was there. The next morning, I drove straight to Owen's office. He listened to the recording twice with his eyes closed. When it finished, he looked at me and said this changed everything. He made copies and called Felix. They spent 2 hours going through all the evidence Felix had collected. Owen said he was filing the recording with the court that afternoon. He also said he was contacting the police in Arizona. They needed to hear this. They needed to reopen the investigation into Celia's death. 2 days later, 2 detectives from Arizona flew out. They met me at Owen's office. One was older with gray hair and tired eyes. The other was younger and took notes on everything. They asked me about Maria. They asked about Haley. They asked about the timeline of when Maria moved here. I told them everything I knew. They played the recording and asked me to verify it was Maria's voice. I said yes. They asked if I had any other evidence. I gave them copies of everything Felix had found. They said they'd need to interview Robert too. I gave them his number. They interviewed Robert at a coffee shop downtown. He called me after and said they'd asked him about his relationship with Maria. They'd asked if he knew Haley wasn't his biological daughter. They'd asked if Maria had ever mentioned Celia. Robert said he told them the truth about everything. He said they were building a case. Felix called me 3 days after the detectives left. His voice sounded different. He said the DNA results came back. Haley was definitely Celia's biological daughter. The match was clear. He said he'd already called Paul with the news. Paul had broken down crying on the phone. He'd been searching for his niece for 22 years. He'd never stopped believing she was alive somewhere. Now he knew the truth. Felix said Paul wanted to meet Haley as soon as possible. I sat in my car for an hour after that call. I didn't know how to tell Haley. How do you tell someone their entire life is a lie? How do you tell them the woman who raised them might have killed their real mother? I called Owen and asked what I should do. He said we needed to tell her soon. He said if we waited, she'd hear it from someone else. He said he'd arrange for a counselor to be present. We scheduled a meeting at his office for the next day. I called Haley that night and asked her to meet me at Owen's office. She asked why. I said we needed to discuss some legal matters about Maria's case. She agreed, but her voice was cold. She still blamed me for everything falling apart. She still thought I was the villain in this story. The next afternoon, I arrived at Owen's office early. The counselor was already there. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a calm voice. She explained how she'd help Haley process the information. Owen had printed out copies of all the evidence, the DNA results, the police reports from Arizona, photos of Celia, photos of baby Haley with Celia at the hospital, everything laid out in a folder on the conference table. Haley walked in at 2 o'clock. She looked at me, then at Owen, then at the counselor. She asked what was going on. I told her to sit down. She did, but she crossed her arms. Owen started talking. He explained about the investigation into her parentage. He explained about Maria not being her biological mother. Haley's face went blank. She said that was impossible. Owen slid the DNA results across the table. She stared at them without touching them. The counselor moved closer and started speaking in that calm voice. Haley shook her head. She said there had to be a mistake. Owen opened the folder and showed her the photos. Celia holding a newborn baby in a hospital bed. The baby had the same birthmark on her shoulder that Haley had. Haley picked up the photo with shaking hands. She looked at Celia's face. She looked at the baby. She put the photo down and stood up. She said this was crazy. She said I was making this up to hurt Maria. She said she was leaving. I stood up too and blocked the door. I played the recording of Maria's confession. Haley listened with tears streaming down her face. When it ended, she collapsed back into the chair. The counselor put a hand on her shoulder. Haley pushed it away. She looked at me with so much anger. She said I'd destroyed her family. She said I'd ruined everything. She said she wished I'd never been part of her life. Then she ran out of the office before anyone could stop her. I tried calling her for 3 days. She didn't answer. Blake finally called me back and said Haley needed time. He said she was processing everything. He said she didn't want to talk to me right now. I asked if she was okay. He said no, but she would be. He said he was taking care of her. Paul called me a week later. He said he was flying out to meet Haley. He'd booked a hotel near her apartment. He had boxes of photos and videos of Celia. He wanted to show Haley who her real mother was. I gave him Blake's number since Haley wasn't talking to me. Paul thanked me for everything I'd done. He said finding his niece was a miracle. He said Celia would have been so proud of the woman Haley became. Paul met Haley at a park 2 days after he arrived. Blake was there too for support. Paul told me about it later. He said Haley barely looked at him at first. Then he showed her a photo of Celia at age 22. Haley stared at it for 5 minutes without saying anything. The resemblance was clear. Same eyes, same smile, same way of tilting her head. Paul showed her videos of Celia laughing, dancing, talking about her dreams. Haley watched every single one. By the end, she was crying. She asked Paul questions about Celia. What was she like? What did she want to be? Did she love her baby? Paul answered everything honestly. He said Celia loved Haley more than anything in the world. He said Celia's last words before she died were about keeping her baby safe. Blake called me after that meeting. He said Haley was starting to accept the truth. She was devastated and confused, but she was listening now. He said she'd asked about me. She wanted to know if I knew all along. Blake told her I'd only found out recently. He told her I'd been trying to protect her. He said Haley didn't respond, but at least she didn't get angry. Blake impressed me through all of this. He could have walked away. Most guys would have. But he stayed by Haley's side every single day. He held her when she cried. He listened when she needed to talk. He gave her space when she needed to be alone. He postponed the wedding without complaint. He told her they'd get married when she was ready, whether that was next month or next year. He focused completely on helping her heal. I called him one night and told him I respected him. He said Haley was worth it. He said he loved her, and nothing would change that. 2 weeks after Paul's visit, the Arizona police arrested Maria. They showed up at her apartment early in the morning with a warrant. The charges were suspicion of murder, kidnapping, and fraud. Maria tried to run, but they caught her in the parking lot. The whole thing was on the local news. I watched the footage of her being put in the police car. She looked small and scared. Nothing like the confident woman who'd lived in my house for 10 years. Arizona requested her extradition. The judge approved it within days. They put Maria on a plane with 2 officers. She'd face trial in Arizona where Celia died, where the crime actually happened. Suddenly, I was the only parental figure Haley had left in the state. Robert was around, but he wasn't reliable. Paul was back in Arizona. Maria was in jail. I was all she had. Blake called me 3 days after Maria's arrest. He said Haley needed help. She couldn't afford her apartment without Maria's financial support. She was too traumatized to be alone. She was having panic attacks every night. Blake was staying with her, but he had to work. He asked if Haley could stay with me for a while, just until she got back on her feet. I said yes immediately. I told him to bring her over whenever she was ready. Haley moved into my guest room that weekend. Blake helped her carry boxes up the stairs. She didn't look at me when she arrived. She went straight to the guest room and closed the door. I heard her crying through the wall that night. I wanted to knock and offer comfort, but I knew she wasn't ready. Our relationship was strained. She was only here because she had nowhere else to go. But at least she was here. At least I could keep her safe while she figured out how to put her life back together. Robert showed up 3 days after Haley moved in. I opened the door and found him standing on my porch looking cleaner than I'd ever seen him. No leather jacket, no cigarette smell. He wore jeans and a button-down shirt that looked recently ironed. He asked if he could talk to Haley. I told him to wait while I checked with her. She was in the guest room staring at her phone. I knocked and told her Robert was here. She looked scared but nodded. We went downstairs together. Robert sat on the couch and Haley sat across from him in the armchair. I stayed standing near the kitchen. Robert told her he needed to be honest about something. He said Maria had been paying him for years to stay away. $500 a month to only visit twice a year and never ask for custody or more time. He took the money because he needed it, and because Maria convinced him Haley was better off with stability. But he said he always cared about her even though he was a terrible father. Haley started crying. She asked how he could take money to abandon her. Robert said he was ashamed and there was no excuse. He said learning he wasn't her biological father made him realize he'd wasted years he could have spent being a real presence in her life. He told her he wanted to try now if she'd let him. He said he'd been going to meetings and had 14 days sober. Haley wiped her eyes and asked why she should believe him this time. Robert pulled out a paper from his pocket. It was a schedule from an addiction treatment center showing daily group sessions he'd signed up for. He said he knew words meant nothing after all his broken promises. He wanted to show up and prove it through actions. Haley looked at me. I told her it was her choice. She told Robert she needed time to think about it. He nodded and said he'd check in next week. He left without asking for anything else. Paul called Haley that same night. I heard her talking on the phone in her room for over an hour. The next morning, she told me Paul wanted to visit and bring photo albums of Celia. She asked if that was okay. I said of course. Paul flew in 4 days later. I picked him up from the airport and we drove back to my house. He brought 2 large albums and a box of letters Celia had written. Haley sat with him at the dining table and went through everything. I gave them space, but I could hear them talking. Paul told stories about Celia as a kid. He said she loved art and wanted to be a teacher. He showed Haley pictures of Celia at different ages. Haley kept saying how much they looked alike. Paul said Celia would have been so proud of her. He stayed for 3 days. By the time he left, Haley was calling him every night. They talked about everything. He told her about family history and shared memories that helped her understand where she came from. She started asking questions about medical history and personality traits. Paul answered everything with patience. Their relationship grew fast because they both needed it. The insurance company called me 2 weeks after Maria's arrest. The investigator said they'd reviewed all the documents I signed 3 years ago. They determined Maria had deliberately tricked me into signing forms that listed her as my spouse for insurance purposes. She'd used those forms to build her common law marriage claim. The investigator said this was fraud, and they were filing their own criminal charges against Maria. They said I wouldn't face any penalties because I was clearly a victim. They also said they were working with Owen to make sure none of Maria's legal claims held up. The investigator asked if I wanted to pursue a civil case against Maria for the money she'd cost me. I said I just wanted it all to go away. He understood but said their criminal case would move forward regardless. Owen called the next day with updates. He said the forged will had been thrown out completely. The notary admitted under questioning that Maria had paid him to backdate the document and notarize it without me present. The common law marriage claim was dismissed because we'd never filed joint taxes or presented ourselves as married except for the insurance fraud. My assets were protected and Maria had no legal claim to anything. Owen said there might be other charges coming as investigators dug deeper into Maria's finances. He found evidence she'd been skimming money from joint accounts we'd shared over the years. Nothing huge, but enough to add to her legal problems. He said I was in the clear legally and could focus on rebuilding my relationship with Haley. Haley started therapy the following week. She found someone who specialized in trauma and family issues. She went twice a week at first. She told me the sessions were hard because she had to talk about everything. She was angry at Maria for lying her whole life. She felt grief for Celia, who she'd never know. She was confused about her identity and who she really was. The therapist helped her work through it all slowly. Some days were better than others. Some nights I heard her crying in her room. Blake came over most evenings after work to be with her. He was steady and supportive. I respected him more each day. The therapist suggested I join some sessions to work on our relationship. I agreed immediately. The first joint session was awkward. We sat on opposite ends of the couch in the therapist's office. The therapist asked us both to talk about how we felt. Haley said she felt guilty for hurting me and taking me for granted. She said Maria had convinced her that blood family was more important than anything else. She believed it because Maria was her mom and she trusted her. I said I felt erased and disrespected when my name wasn't on the invitation, and Robert got to walk her down the aisle. I explained I'd raised her and paid for everything, but none of that seemed to matter. The therapist helped us understand that we'd both been manipulated by Maria in different ways. She said Maria had created a toxic dynamic where love was conditional on following her rules. She helped us see that real family was about commitment and care, not biology or obligation. We had 3 more joint sessions over the next month. Each one helped us communicate better and understand each other's pain. Haley came to my office one Saturday morning and asked if we could talk. We sat in the living room with coffee. She apologized for excluding me from the wedding plans. She said she was wrong to prioritize Robert just because he was her biological father. She explained that Maria had been in her ear constantly saying blood family had to come first, and that I would understand because I wasn't really her dad. She said she realized now how manipulated she'd been. She told me I was the only real father she'd ever had, and she was sorry for not seeing that sooner. She cried and said she took me for granted because I was always there, and Robert wasn't. She thought she had to chase Robert's love while mine was guaranteed. She understood now that was backwards. I told her I was sorry too. I said my confrontation at dinner was harsh and dramatic. I explained I felt erased when I saw the invitation without my name, and when Robert took my place walking her down the aisle. I said I should have talked to her privately instead of making a scene in front of everyone. I admitted canceling the wedding was an overreaction born from hurt and anger. I told her I could have handled everything better, and I regretted the pain I caused. She said she understood why I reacted that way. She said she would have done the same thing if someone treated her like an ATM after 10 years. We agreed to start fresh. We promised to communicate honestly going forward and respect each other's feelings. Haley said she appreciated everything I'd done for her over the years. She listed specific things like teaching her to drive and helping with college applications and being there when she was sick. She said those actions made me her real dad regardless of biology. I told her she'd been a victim of Maria's manipulation just like me. I said I didn't blame her for the choices she made when she was lied to constantly. We hugged and it felt like a weight lifted. Our relationship wasn't perfect, but it was honest now. Blake and Haley came over for dinner 2 weeks later. After we ate, they said they had something to ask me. Haley said they decided to get married at the courthouse with just close family. She said they didn't want a big wedding anymore after everything that happened. Blake said they wanted something simple and meaningful. Then Haley asked if I would walk her down the aisle. She said I was her real father and she wanted me there in that role. I felt my throat get tight. I told them I'd be honored. Haley started crying happy tears. She said this was how it should have been from the start. Blake shook my hand and thanked me for everything. We picked a date 3 weeks away and started planning a small celebration. Paul called me the next day with an offer. He wanted to pay for a small reception after the courthouse wedding. I told him he didn't need to do that. He said Haley deserved something special after everything Maria put her through. I agreed to split the cost with him. We found a nice restaurant with a private room that could hold about 30 people. Paul handled the Arizona side of the guest list while I invited my brother and closest friends. Blake's parents were included too. The planning gave Haley something positive to focus on while the legal case built momentum. She picked out flowers and a simple white dress. Blake rented a suit. They seemed happy making plans together without all the drama and pressure from before. The Arizona prosecutors worked fast building their case against Maria. Paul gave them boxes of evidence about Celia's disappearance and death. Felix sent over his entire investigation file with witness statements and timeline documentation. The recording I made of Maria's midnight confession got submitted as evidence too. Owen told me the prosecutors felt confident about getting a conviction. Maria was looking at serious prison time between the murder charge, kidnapping, and all the fraud. Her public defender tried arguing she gave Haley a good life, and that should count for something. The prosecutors weren't buying it. They said Maria stole a baby, faked documents, and probably killed the real mother. No amount of college tuition payments changed those facts. Maria's lawyer reached out to Owen about a plea deal 6 weeks before trial. They offered to plead guilty to kidnapping and fraud charges in exchange for dropping the murder charges against Maria. Owen called me and Paul on a conference line to discuss it. I was willing to consider the deal if it meant avoiding a trial. Paul shut that down immediately. He said his sister deserved full justice and he wouldn't accept any deal that let Maria avoid the murder charge. He reminded me that Maria likely drugged Celia and staged an overdose to steal her baby. I understood his position. Owen told Maria's lawyer we were rejecting the plea offer. They'd have to take their chances at trial. The trial started on a cold morning in Phoenix. I flew out with Haley and Blake to be there. Paul met us at the courthouse looking tired but determined. The prosecution laid out their case methodically over 3 days. They showed the jury photos of baby Haley with Celia. They presented birth certificates and medical records proving Celia was the biological mother. They played my recording of Maria's confession. Felix testified about his investigation and the inconsistencies in Maria's story. On day 4, Haley had to take the stand. I sat in the gallery watching her walk to the witness box in a navy dress. The prosecutor asked her about growing up with Maria. Haley described a childhood where Maria controlled everything and isolated her from outside family. She talked about Maria's manipulation and the lies about her parentage. She cried when discussing how Maria used her to commit fraud against me. The defense attorney tried making Haley admit she had a good life, but she held firm. She said material comfort didn't justify kidnapping and murder. She handled the whole thing with more strength than I expected. When she stepped down, Paul squeezed my shoulder and we both had tears in our eyes. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they came back, the courtroom went silent. The foreman stood and read the verdict. Guilty of second-degree murder. guilty of kidnapping, guilty of fraud and identity theft. Maria's face went white. Her lawyer put a hand on her shoulder, but she just stared straight ahead. The judge set sentencing for 3 weeks later. At that hearing, Maria got 30 years in prison with no parole eligibility for 20. Haley sat between Paul and me in the gallery. When the judge announced the sentence, she started crying quietly. I put my arm around her shoulders. She leaned into me and whispered that she felt relieved but also sad. I told her that made sense. Maria was still the woman who raised her, even if everything was built on lies and violence. After the hearing, we walked out into bright Arizona sunshine. Paul suggested getting lunch, but Haley said she needed to be alone for a while. Blake took her back to the hotel. Paul and I grabbed coffee instead and sat in silence for a long time. 2 months after the sentencing, Haley filed paperwork to legally change her last name to Williams. She wanted to honor Celia and connect with her biological family. The process took about 6 weeks. When the approval came through, Haley called me crying happy tears. She said it felt right to carry her real mother's name. She asked if I was upset she wasn't keeping my last name. I told her I never expected her to take my name anyway, since we weren't legally related. What mattered was that she was claiming her true identity after years of lies. She thanked me for understanding. A week later, she received her new driver's license and social security card in the mail. Haley Williams. She posted a photo on social media with a caption about reclaiming herself. The comments filled with support from friends who knew what she'd been through. Paul invited Haley and Blake to visit Arizona and meet extended family who never knew she existed. They flew out for a week and stayed at Paul's house. He arranged a big family dinner where Haley met aunts, uncles, and cousins. Paul sent me photos from the gathering. Haley stood in the middle of a group of people who all had her eyes and smile. She looked genuinely happy, surrounded by blood relatives for the first time in her life. One of Celia's sisters broke down crying when she met Haley, saying it was like seeing her sister alive again. Haley spent the week learning about Celia through family stories and old photo albums. She visited Celia's grave and left flowers. Paul told me later that Haley sat at the gravestone for an hour talking to the mother she never got to know. When Haley came back home, she seemed more settled and at peace with everything that happened. Robert and I started talking more after the trial ended. We met for coffee one Saturday and had an honest conversation about Maria's manipulation. He admitted he felt used and stupid for taking her money to stay away from Haley. I told him I understood because Maria fooled me too for 10 years. We talked about how she played us against each other to maintain control. Robert said he was working on getting sober and building a more honest life. He'd been attending meetings and got a steady job at a motorcycle repair shop. I respected that he was trying to change. We started meeting every few weeks for coffee or lunch. It felt strange becoming friends with the man I resented for years, but we bonded over surviving Maria's lies. Haley noticed the friendship developing and said it made her happy that 2 people she cared about were getting along. My brother Micah came over one evening with pizza and beer. We sat on my back porch talking about everything that happened over the past year. Micah had supported me through all of it, listening to me vent and offering advice when I needed it. That night, he told me he was proud of how I handled everything. He said a lot of men would have walked away from Haley completely after learning she wasn't really their stepdaughter. I told him I couldn't do that because I raised her and loved her regardless of biology. Micah said that's exactly what made me a real father. He reminded me that being a dad is about love and commitment, not DNA or legal documents. It's about showing up every day and putting someone else's needs above your own. He said I did that for Haley for 10 years, and nothing Maria did could erase those years or change what they meant. His words hit me hard. I'd been struggling with feeling like a fool for being manipulated, but Micah helped me see that loving Haley was never foolish. It was the realest thing in the whole mess. The courthouse wedding happened on a sunny Saturday morning 3 months after Maria's sentencing. Haley wore a simple white dress and carried a small bouquet of roses. Blake looked nervous but happy in his rented suit. About 30 people gathered in the courthouse chapel. The judge who married them was kind and made the ceremony feel personal despite the basic setting. When it came time for Haley to walk down the aisle, she asked me and Paul to walk her together, one on each side. We practiced the night before to get the timing right. The moment arrived and Haley linked her arms through ours. We walked her slowly toward Blake, who was wiping tears from his eyes. Haley looked beautiful and genuinely happy. At the altar, Paul and I each kissed her cheek before stepping back. The ceremony itself lasted maybe 10 minutes. Simple vows, exchange of rings, and the judge pronounced them married. Everyone clapped and Haley kissed Blake. Afterward, we moved to the restaurant for the reception Paul and I planned. The restaurant Paul and I picked was small and quiet with good food and space for everyone who mattered. About 20 people showed up, including Blake's parents, Robert, Micah, and some of Haley's college friends who stuck by her through everything. The room had white tablecloths and soft lighting that made everything feel warm and comfortable. We ate good food and talked and laughed, and it felt right, in a way the big fancy wedding never would have. After dinner ended and dessert plates got cleared away, Haley stood up and tapped her glass with her fork. The room got quiet and everyone turned to look at her. She was still wearing her simple white dress and her face looked nervous but happy. She cleared her throat and started talking about how the past year changed everything she thought she knew about family and love and what really matters. Her voice shook a little at first but got stronger as she kept going. She talked about learning that biology doesn't make someone your parent, and that showing up every day matters more than DNA ever could. She looked right at me when she said she was grateful I never gave up on her even when she hurt me and didn't deserve my patience. She said I was her real father in every way that counted, and nothing would ever change that. Her eyes filled with tears, and so did mine. Blake squeezed her hand and Paul wiped his eyes with his napkin. When she finished, everyone clapped and I had to stand up because my chest felt too full to stay sitting. I raised my glass and waited for the room to get quiet again. I welcomed Blake to our family and told him he was getting an amazing woman who survived more trauma than most people face in a lifetime. I said I was proud of Haley for her strength and her heart, and her ability to forgive even when forgiveness seemed impossible. I meant every word, and by the time I finished talking, half the room was crying, including Blake's mother, who kept dabbing her eyes with a tissue. After the toasts, Paul pulled me aside near the back of the room where it was quieter. We stood there for a minute, not saying anything, just watching Haley and Blake dance their first dance as a married couple. Paul told me he was grateful Haley had me in her life all those years when he didn't even know she existed. He said knowing she had a father figure who truly cared made the pain of losing his sister a little easier to bear. We talked about Celia and how much Haley looked like her and acted like her from what Paul remembered. He said Celia would have loved me for taking care of her daughter the way I did. We shook hands and then hugged, and I felt like I gained a brother through all this mess. Paul said we were family now whether we planned it or not, and that felt true and good. 2 weeks after the wedding, I got a call from the insurance company's legal department. They reviewed all the evidence Owen provided about Maria's fraud and how she manipulated me into signing those domestic partner forms. The woman on the phone apologized for the stress their investigation caused and said they were dropping all claims against me. She explained they were pursuing criminal charges against Maria for insurance fraud on top of everything else she was facing in Arizona. My financial situation finally stabilized and I could breathe again without worrying about losing everything. I called Haley that same day and told her I wanted to help with a down payment on her first house with Blake. She cried on the phone and tried to say no, but I insisted. She deserved a good start after everything she went through. 3 months later, Haley walked across the stage at her college graduation. She finished a semester late because of all the chaos with Maria's arrest and the trial, but she made it. Blake and Paul and Robert and I all sat together in the auditorium cheering when they called her name. She wore her cap and gown and walked with her head high, and I felt so proud I thought my chest might burst. After the ceremony, we took her to dinner and celebrated properly. Robert looked healthier than I'd seen him in years. He told us he completed rehab and got a steady job at a motorcycle repair shop across town. He wasn't perfect and probably never would be, but he was trying. Haley appreciated having him show up consistently for the first time in her life. She hugged him after dinner and told him she was proud of him, and I saw tears in his eyes. A month after graduation, Haley and Blake found a small house 3 miles from mine. It needed work, but had good bones and a nice backyard. They used my down payment gift and got a mortgage they could actually afford on their salaries. Haley called me the day they closed and said she wanted to live close, so her future kids could know their grandfather. She said she wanted them to understand that family is built through love and dedication, not biology. I helped them move in on a Saturday with Micah and Paul, and even Robert showed up with his truck. We carried boxes and furniture and set up their new life together. That same month, Paul flew back to Arizona and started working on something he'd been planning for a while. He created a memorial scholarship at Celia's old high school for single mothers trying to get their education. He set it up in Celia's name and funded it with money from selling her old house that had been sitting empty all these years. Haley helped him with the paperwork and the application process, and she told me it gave her purpose to honor the mother she never got to know. The first scholarship got awarded that fall to a 19-year-old mom taking night classes, and Haley cried when Paul sent her the photo. A year after Maria's trial ended, Haley and I started having dinner every Sunday at my house. We'd cook together, usually something simple like pasta or chicken, and we'd talk about everything. Work and marriage and plans for the future and sometimes the past, but mostly we just enjoyed being together. Our relationship felt stronger than it ever was before the crisis. The lies getting exposed and the truth coming out cleared away all the confusion about where we stood. She was my daughter in every way that mattered, and I was her father. Nothing would change that. Blake got promoted at his job to senior analyst with a decent raise. Haley started a new position at a nonprofit she loved that helped foster kids. They were building a good life together, paying their mortgage and saving money and making plans. I was proud of how they handled everything with maturity and grace. Most couples wouldn't survive the kind of stress and trauma they went through before even getting married, but they came out stronger. Every Sunday when Haley showed up at my door with groceries for dinner, I felt grateful we made it through the nightmare and came out the other side as a real family. 6 months after Blake's promotion, Haley showed up at my door one Sunday with a mischievous grin and her laptop. She set it on my kitchen table and opened a dating app. I told her I wasn't interested in that stuff, but she waved me off and started typing. She asked about my hobbies and what kind of person I wanted to meet, making jokes about how I needed someone who appreciated me instead of using me as an ATM. We spent 2 hours setting up my profile with photos she insisted looked good, and a bio she wrote that made me sound way more interesting than I felt. She uploaded everything, and within an hour, I had 3 messages waiting. Haley squealed and hugged me, saying she was proud of me for putting myself out there again. I went on a few dates over the next couple months, nothing serious, but it felt good to remember what it was like to have someone interested in me for who I was, instead of what I could provide. Robert hit his 1-year sober mark in September. Haley called me crying happy tears and said she wanted to throw him a small party at her house. I showed up with Blake's parents and Paul, who flew in from Arizona for the weekend. Robert looked healthier than I'd ever seen him, his face less puffy and his eyes clear. Haley had made a cake with 365 days written in frosting, and we all stood in her tiny living room celebrating this man who used to show up drunk and unreliable. Robert gave a short speech about how he never thought he'd make it this far, how Haley believing in him made all the difference. He thanked me too, which surprised me, saying I showed him what real fatherhood looked like and made him want to try harder. We shook hands and I realized I didn't resent him anymore. He would never be what I was to Haley, but he was trying to be something good in his own way, and that mattered. Paul started visiting every few months instead of just holidays. He'd stay at my place in the guest room and we'd have breakfast together before he went to see Haley. Sometimes all of us would have dinner together, Blake and Haley and Paul and me, talking about Celia and Arizona and the family Haley never knew she had. Paul showed her more photos and videos, told stories about her mother's laugh and her dreams. Haley said it helped her feel connected to where she came from, gave her roots she didn't know existed. Paul told me once over coffee that he was grateful Haley had me all those years, that even though the circumstances were horrible, at least she grew up loved and cared for. We became real family, not just connected by tragedy, but by choice and commitment. My house transformed over the next year. The rooms that felt empty after Maria's arrest started filling up with noise and laughter. Haley and Blake came over twice a week for dinner. Paul visited every other month and stayed for long weekends. Robert showed up for game nights, sober and on time, bringing pizza or beer. Micah drove in from his place an hour away to join us for Sunday football. We created new traditions, things that had nothing to do with Maria or the past. Friday movie nights where we'd argue about what to watch. Saturday morning pancakes when Paul was visiting. Birthday celebrations that involved too much food and terrible singing. The house stopped feeling like a place where bad things happened and started feeling like home again. One Sunday in March, Haley arrived for dinner looking nervous and excited. She kept fidgeting with her napkin while we ate the roast chicken I'd made. Blake had this huge smile on his face like he was about to burst. Finally, after we cleared the plates, Haley took my hand and told me she was pregnant. She asked if I would be grandpa to her baby, her voice shaking. I pulled her into a hug and felt tears running down my face. Everything we went through, all the pain and lies and legal battles, led to this moment where my daughter trusted me enough to raise her child in my life. I told her I would be honored, that being her dad was the best thing that ever happened to me, and being grandpa would be even better. Haley went into labor on a Tuesday morning in November. Blake called me from the hospital and I drove there breaking probably 6 traffic laws. I sat in the waiting room with Paul and Robert, all of us anxious and excited. When the nurse finally let us back, Haley was holding this tiny bundle wrapped in a blue blanket. She looked exhausted and beautiful and so happy. She told me his name was Michael, after me, and asked if I wanted to hold him. I took my grandson in my arms and looked at his perfect little face and felt this overwhelming sense of peace. The family we built from the wreckage of Maria's lies surrounded me in that hospital room. Blake standing proud next to Haley's bed. Paul wiping tears from his eyes. Robert grinning like an idiot. All of us connected not by blood or obligation, but by choice and love and commitment through the hardest times. Michael's baptism happened 6 months later at a small church near Haley's house. Family and friends packed the pews, including some of my business partners who never made it to the original wedding, but were here for this. After the ceremony, we gathered at my house for a celebration. Haley stood up in my living room holding Michael and gave a speech that made everyone cry. She talked about how family isn't defined by blood or obligation, but by love and commitment. She said I showed her what real fatherhood looks like through action, not words, by staying when things got hard and loving her even when she didn't deserve it. She thanked me for never giving up on her, for fighting to keep her in my life when everything fell apart. Michael gurgled in her arms and everyone laughed, and I felt this completeness I never expected to have again. Life turned out better than I could have imagined after that terrible dinner confrontation 2 years ago. I gained a son-in-law I respect who stood by my daughter through hell. I reconnected with Haley on honest terms without lies or manipulation between us. I welcomed Paul as true family, not just someone connected by tragedy, but a real brother. Robert became someone I could trust to show up and be present. Micah stayed my rock through everything. And now I'm grandpa to beautiful baby Michael who has my name and my daughter's eyes. The wedding drama that almost destroyed us instead cleared away all the lies and revealed what really matters. The people who show up when things get hard, the ones who stay committed through pain and confusion. The family you choose and build through action and love. Haley and I are closer than we ever were before, and sitting in my living room surrounded by everyone we fought to keep, I wouldn't change a single thing about how it all worked out.